Okay,
Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my honor and privilege to welcome Rabbi Yosef Blau, one of the foremost Rabbonim in America today, who has had an impact on generations of students at Yeshiva University, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary, in his role as the mashgiach of the yeshiva, and also as former president of the Religious Zionists of America, and for those from Chicago, as also former principal of what is now known as the Fasmi Yeshiva High School. So, Rabbi Blau, it's a pleasure to have you with us for this short conversation of today. Thank you for joining me.
it's my pleasure to participate in anything that comes from the Hebrew Theological College.
Sounds
I feel
good.
warm about my years in Chicago, even though they were quite a long time ago.
A couple of years back, but looking backwards a little bit, Rabbi Blau, your career is extraordinary. The impact you've had on so many people is exceptional. I'm wondering, who were your teachers? Who helped you become the Rav that you are and the leader of Klal Yisrael that you are today?
Well, I'll accept the fact that you exaggerated my importance, but I can talk about the Rebbeim that I had that influenced me. I will start with being in elementary school at Yeshiva Eitz Chaim in Borough Park, and they separated out from the sixth grade 8 students to have a special Gemara shir with an older European Rav named Rabbi Binamovich. And from the 8, after the year, they kept 4. And for the other half of the morning, 4 7th graders and 4 8th graders were in the second Gemara Shir by Rabbi Binamovich. I'm not so sure. As an educator, I would recommend schools duplicating that today. But that's what they did. And it turned out that I very much took learning Gemara. And I really developed tremendous interest in Gemara and skills through being in a class with such a relatively small number of students who were chosen from a larger group. When I was in high school, the Rebbe I most identified with was the late Rabbi Tzvik Kanatopsky, who was one of the earliest Talmidim of Rav Soloveitchik in yeshiva, and had an independent mind. He was also Rabbi Young Israel of Crown Heights, and I used to walk from Borough Park to Crown Heights on Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol to hear his drashos, which was really some learning because it was independent. He never took a shir off the shelf. He never copied some of the many shiurim that had been given on these topics. Always analyzed something on his own. His honesty and his creativity was extremely appealing. And then when I came to yeshiva, I had a few rebbeim, but overwhelmingly it was the exposure to the Rav. Exposure to the Rav was particularly important in that era, and for students like myself, born in America, from modern Orthodox parents, where becoming a rabbi was not considered a wise move. The rabbit wasn't treated very well in those days, and it was critical that one have a Rebbe who was intellectually capable of competing with the brightest secular faculty to make the notion of devoting oneself to Talmud Torah or into the Jewish community an appropriate alternative than going to law school and becoming a lawyer like my father.
So,
And
Rabbi
Rob was
Blau,
really
if I can interrupt for a
everybody.
second, if I can interrupt for a second. So you had Rav Soloveitchik, it was the early 1950s, the mid 1950s, as a Rebbe. We hear stories that he was a fierce teacher, that the fellows
Okay,
walk in. What was it like in his shir?
all right. It depended over the years. And I had the chus of being in a shir 2 years in college and 2 years now 2 years of a smicha. And then I stayed in the shir. And when I was working for him at Maimonides, I actually went to a semi-private shir with only 3 people in it, besides the Rav. And then when I was mashgiach, I went back to the shir. And over the years, the Rav softened as he got older. As his son Chaim used to say, what happened to my father that I recognize? He's now this grandfather figure being so supportive of Talmidim. In my day, if a Talmud said it as far that the Rav thought was made no sense, he got blasted. In the last years, the Rav said Shir, the boy would offer a suggestion that didn't make much sense, and the Rav would say, "You meant to say," and then gave a wonderful explanation that no way in the world the fellow had meant to say, but of course he agreed that he had meant to say it. It was just a shifting over the years. The Rav was deeply devoted to a commitment to learning, to figuring out what the sugya of the Rishonim meant. And I very much remember 2 things. One was when the beginning of the year of 1958, and the smicha plan was going to learn Yoredeya, and the office was afraid that undergraduates in the Rav Shir would be learning Yoredeya so young that you want to get early smicha. So they said, we're throwing you all out of the Shir. And I had been in the Shir just for a few months the year before. And the Rav understood that you couldn't throw out all the younger people. The younger people were on the Shir with the older ones. It probably meant they were at least as good. They got up the Shir ranks much faster. So he gave a separate Shir for the undergraduates. And only a handful of us had been in his Shir before. We were learning Sanhedrin. He asked the question on the Rashi and the definition of Gzela, didn't like the first person's answer, and started going up and down the rows. And once people thought that was the wrong answer because they had no idea how concerned the Rav was in proper formulation of something, not just knowing it vaguely. So after a while, they got panicked and they started saying ridiculous explanations, and the Rav got more and more worked up. He went through this year, and somehow, even though we thought he didn't know who we were, he skipped all the boys who had been in the shir before, because they would know what the Rav wanted. And then in the end, told the shir, if you're not serious, maybe we shouldn't have the shir. You better come to the next year prepared, which scared well, didn't scare us who knew what the Rabbi wanted, but we were a handful, scared the shir completely, and the whole tone changed the year.
When
The
you were in the
second,
shir, was he teaching it in Yiddish or was it already in English?
I'm sorry, the
Was
shir, even this smaller shir had 30,
no, but I'm
30
saying was he teaching in Yiddish or was he teaching in English?
Yiddish. The Rav switched in the early 60s, not 63, to English in the 50s. Not only was the Rav's teaching in Yiddish, the entire yeshiva on the college level was in Yiddish. Now, I had the senior Rebbe, senior shir in high school was already in Yiddish. So I had some exposure. And most of us came from families where our parents spoke Yiddish, even if they didn't speak Yiddish to us. So we picked up something. But there were some boys in the yeshiva who knew no Yiddish, and there was no option. All right. The option was to go to the Teachers Institute. If you wanted to stay in the yeshiva program, all the shurim were in Yiddish. Either you figured out enough Yiddish to survive, or you had to go out because literally no options. The second story was the Rabbi explained this complicated sugya, but was not happy with his own explanation. Now, I don't know to what degree this was part of his educational method, and to what degree he really didn't like the pshat he said. So he spent, and we had shir twice a week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We spent the rest of the time preparing. When he came back on Tuesday, he came back with a totally new pshat, which solves all the problems. And then he turned to us and said, I was very concerned about not knowing the pshat. I spent the whole of a Shabbos, the whole weekend, working on the sugya till I figured it out. And you sit in the room very comfortable, waiting for me to explain it to you. Why don't you have the same concern? Why aren't you spending sleepless nights about not knowing the correct pshat? And that's it. And that was the rub. The Rav was intensely devoted to learning and to integrity. Integrity was if you called on you and you weren't prepared. It happened to me once. At one point, the Rav decided he didn't like the way I read, so he was going to have me read every day till he was satisfied, which made the rest of the shiva very happy. The rest of the shiva very happy. He was never going to get called on. And we were in college, and the Rebbe said she had during our college finals. And then he decided to skip a couple of Blau Bagadata, and I wasn't that much ahead of this year because I was studying for final. And but I didn't have the nerve to tell the Rebbe I can't read today. So he caught me in not and really trying to make a landing on the spot, which was very foolish on my part. And he told me I was a liar by saying that I was prepared, and I wasn't. Because that was, if you're not prepared, take your chances, but take your risk and say I'm not prepared. No, none of this stuff. And the Rav really gave it to me, and to make up for it, he called on me to read the next day again, as if nothing had happened, and then never called on me again. All the years that I was this year subsequent to that day.
Now, he didn't call on you again. Is that a sign that he had confidence that you were reading well, or he had already?
I hope he had confidence in me. When in 1965, he offered me the position of assistant principal of Maimonides and the 12th grade Gemara Rabbi. So I'd like to believe he didn't ask me to do that if he didn't think I could do a good job.
Now, if you take your experiences in yeshiva with the Rav, and before that, in your elementary school experiences today, and you try to put it into what the experiences of the fellows in yeshiva today are, the day school graduates and the experiences of today.
Okay,
are we preparing people the same way?
No. I find the kids today, it's a product of something on one hand, which is extremely positive, which is the expansion of yeshiva education. So you have so many more students studying in the yeshiva elementary schools and high schools with a lowering of standards. Part of it had to do, again, numbers. When you had very small numbers, they were very committed because most people didn't do it. Now you want everybody to have yeshiva education. We now realize religious identity very much depends on everybody getting, at least 12 years and hopefully plus a year or two in Israel as a minimum to stay religious. For those years, it was much more educational, not as concerned with behavior. It was educational. And so the focus has shifted a lot. Today we have in YU and in a lot of other places, boys who are neo-Hasidic, which is serves a discussion on its own. It was inconceivable in my day. All the Rebbeim in the yeshivas were Litvaks, Misnagdim. Everybody. Hasidim was somebody else. We didn't have anything to do with them. Not the original version, not a revised version, not a new version. So everything was learning. Now, everything has its pluses and minuses. After a number of years and working in yeshivas, uh,
Blau,
if
you've
a
frozen, unfortunately.
student learns well, then he's obviously nice and religious and everything else falls in place. And if a kid's a great kid who doesn't have a good head for learning Gemara, he's a bum. And it took a little while to realize that while yeshiva education was necessary for the religious survival of the community, it had to have broader criteria than someone who learned well versus someone who didn't. And therefore, focus had to change. But along the change of focus, the striving for intellectual accomplishments has been reduced. There's no question about it. I was just listening to a podcast from a couple teaching in yeshivas in Israel. He teaches in a male school and she teaches in a female seminary. And they spoke the whole time about making kids more religious, having kids ask the question, what do I think God wants me to do? If they talked about learning a text, they talked about learning a Musa text. There was not a word talking about levels of Tanakh or Talmud. No, that wasn't the purposes. The purpose is to have them have a very positive religious experience while learning in Israel, which was an environment that they could control to a great degree and impact on their religious life. So they'd want to continue in yeshiva, but it didn't always mean that they had to grow in their learning skills. So it's a very different world.
So if you had that magic wand and could structure Jewish education today, would you move it back more towards the rigor of the academic, the rigor of the learning? Would you keep it where it is? Would you move it to the other way to more of the affective?
Okay, that's a really tough question. What I suspect is, again, influenced by separating out the top students when I was already in elementary school, that I would at least try to set up levels so the students who have the ability be given the opportunity to really grow in learning. I say once you make learning for everybody, you have to accept the fact that not everybody has the capacity to be successful in learning, and a failure in something always has a negative effect on people. If I can make an analogy without getting too political, in the European yeshivos, I just read an article where someone is studying the Haredi community in Israel. And in their academic studies, they first discussed the yeshiva world of Eastern Europe, right? And they discussed the numbers of people attending yeshivos in the 1930s, before the Second World War. And the number was given, and she was waiting for the teacher to describe the next additional number learning in different kinds of yeshivos. And she raised her hand and said, how could it be so few? And the professor said to her, you just don't know your history. Yeshiva education, I'm not talking about going to cheder. I'm talking about serious yeshiva education. In the Mir and Slobodka, and Telz and the major yeshivas in Eastern Europe, it was elitist. They weren't that big. It was meant for the top students. It may have not, I may be exaggerating that there weren't students who got in who weren't top level because either came from rabbinic families or very wealthy families. But in general, it was meant only for the Mitziyonim. It wasn't meant for everybody. And now in Israel, they've convinced the whole Haredi community that they're considering the history of everybody learning all day, whether they are good at it or not, whether they have the patience for it or not. But historically, it isn't true. Now, to try to accommodate both goals, right? Encouraging those who have the ability and stimulating them, getting the top rebbeim so they can really grow while not discouraging all the other students, which means working about affect, is bringing in the non-formal education into schools. So, sometimes it means you bring the NC of Bnei Akiva into the school, or you do programs just like Bnei Akiva and NC would do. But it's a difficult balance to maintain. You're the one who has to deal with it on a daily basis.
No, I find that we do much more informal programming. Part of it is also even the youth groups have shifted drastically. It used to be they took care of that whole realm, and now it became more event oriented, a big Shabbaton versus a weekly something. But schools have shifted. But it's what I find fascinating is that we generally are looking to make sure that the students who have different learning styles, sometimes they're weaker, sometimes just different, that we're accommodating them. But the outstanding students, we sometimes just say, well, he'll be fine, as opposed to creating programs on all areas for those who are a little less academically motivated, those who are mainstream, and then those who are the exceptional good students. It seems that last group is the one that sometimes get lost in the picture.
Okay, so in yeshiva, now I'm talking about students who have chosen to continue after. I'm not talking about the Mechina program for people without background. I'm talking for people who've been in the system often from kindergarten, and in today's world, from large majority of them, it means learning in Israel after high school first. Those who are still in or in yeshiva, we would assume are the highly motivated ones, or at least come from families where their parents are highly motivated for them. And we offer a lot of different programs. And the shurim are not equivalent. I'm unhappy that we don't have levels, specific levels like we used to have, but everybody knows, come back from Israel, which shir is very demanding, and which shir, the Rabbi tells stories, and they sing a lot, and they learn, but we're not with the same kind of intensity and demands. So we try to balance it. Whether we're always successful or not, I don't know. A lot of it is much more controlled. For example, when I was a Talmud in yeshiva, learning at night was voluntary, completely voluntary. And it wasn't that many people who learned at night. It was before they had gone to Israel. But those who did learned sometimes many hours at night, and they learned whatever they thought they should be learning. It was very open-ended. If you were very hard shiur, you worked on preparing or reviewing the shiur. If you had an interest in machshava, so you had a chavrusa and you learned machshava. If you're interested in pursuing Tanakh, which wasn't taught enough, you did it. You learned whatever you wanted to learn. Now the yeshiva is much more successful in getting people to come to the night seder, but it's very formal. The night seder is from 8 to 10. These are the hours. And people's colleges schedules don't always work that way, that simply. And you have to go if you want to be part of the element that sees itself as the yeshivish element. On the other hand, you learn other prakim in the yeshiva's Masechta with guidelines and tests. It gives people direction. On the other hand, it controls them much more. Doesn't really allow for people who want to grow in different areas and are intellectually inclined to just do it.
In yeshiva today, and again, I apologize. I haven't been to Yeshiva University for over a year already, and things may be changing faster than I'm aware of.
No,
There
they don't
seem to
change
be
that.
there seem to be different groups. There's a more, and I'll use an imprecise terminology, more yeshivish element. I think they call it why you write. There is the center, which seems to be more the mainstream of probably the future of many of the modern Orthodox Balabatim, and then there's a group of people who are still on the path. Has the
Well, that's true.
has the why you
Why
write
is not
moved
a
moved away?
singular place.
Yeah, but has the why you write moved away a little bit from the Torah Umada idea?
Yeah. Well, you have to think also in terms of the general society. The general society, from what I know, has become less intellectual and much more interested in making money. So there are plenty of students in yeshiva who would be much more the Torah in Parnasa model than Torah Umada. So, for example, when I was a student, there was no business school. Dr. Belkin would never have dreamt of a business school. The Rav would never have dreamt of a business school. Going to college was to broaden your intellectual horizons and enable you to become a professional. Means afterward you went, if you didn't stay for smicha, you went to law school, you went to medical school, you went to graduate school. Now, when you graduate, you get a job, hopefully in a nice large corporation, and you work in data management. You know, it's a very different world. But I think it's reflective of the general society to a certain degree. It's more than being an independent kind of thing. It's very expensive to be an Orthodox Jew, no question about it. Many things are much more expensive. Living in a Jewish neighborhood inevitably means the housing is much more expensive. Tuition has gone up tremendously. But, the other way of looking at it is, yes, when I went to Shiva Elementary School, tuition was, by today's standards, very low. But they weren't very low by the standards of how much money people made those years. Right? And the parents are very worried about the kids making a good living. So the whole mentality has shifted. I think there are more students in Psi Sims, which is the business undergraduate school, than there is in Yeshiva College. Right? The mentality has shifted. So it's not intellectually inclined, which works very well for people who turn more yeshivish, so they don't have to deal with the ideas of the secular society. They have to know how to work a computer, and a computer is religiously neutral.
Rev Blau, this has been fascinating. I have to apologize, though. Our time is really up. It has gone by very quickly.
I'm sorry.
No,
got going
I
too
enjoyed
much
this.
at once.
I
Because I do
enjoyed
leave
this
out
tremendously. So,
one very important
please.
element, which didn't come up, but should really come up. Yeah, I've been in the rabbinate, but I've been a mashgiach in a yeshiva. A mashgiach in a yeshiva is a very particular role, and it's not the same as being a rabbi of a congregation. It's not the same as a teacher or even a principal, which I was at one point, a principal in a school. And it has to deal with ethical and moral issues and personal issues. And how I got into that when I never would have dreamt that I would have as a youngster is an interesting question, which I guess we won't have time to answer now, but maybe you can invite me back sometime in the future.
I think I will, because this has been a lot of fun and very informative. Rev Blau, thank you so very much. If we don't talk, Achad Kosher v'Sameach. I know some people might be scared to think Pesach's that close already, but it is. And please send my best to your wife as well. And it is a pleasure to have time with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Okay, thank you very much. It was also my pleasure to be at a dinner last night in which you and your wife were honored.
Thank you for being there. Bye-bye.
Bye.